If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Whispers in the Dark. Activate notifications and be prepared to hear whispers that may haunt you even in the silence of the night. Real stories, mysterious events, and spine-chilling tales. But beware, fear will always be your companion here. Click the subscribe button before it's too late. The Mysterious Kayaker, Ontario, Canada. It was supposed to be just another quiet night at the camp. The kids had gone to bed after a long day of swimming and hiking, and my co-counselor Lisa and I were sitting by the fire, enjoying the rare moment of peace. The lake was perfectly still, the moonlight making the water shimmer like glass. That's when we saw her, a woman in a kayak, slowly paddling toward our dock. At first, I thought it was just someone from another camp, maybe out for a late-night paddle. But as she got closer, something about her felt off. She wasn't dressed for the water, no life jacket, no proper gear, just a dark hoodie and what looked like jeans. Her movements were jerky, almost mechanical, like she wasn't entirely sure how to use the paddle. When she finally reached the dock, Lisa and I stood up, instinctively stepping back. "Hi there," Lisa called out, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the unease in her voice. The woman didn't respond right away. She just sat there, staring up at us with this hollow expression. Then, finally, she spoke. "Are your campers safe?" Her voice was flat, almost monotone, like she was reading a script. The question made my stomach drop. I tried to shake it off. Maybe she was just a concerned local or something. But there was something in her tone, in her stare, that made my skin crawl. Lisa and I exchanged a nervous glance. "Yeah, they're fine," I said, my voice cracking a little. The woman just nodded, turned her kayak around, and began paddling away, disappearing into the darkness as suddenly as she had appeared. Lisa and I didn't say much after that. We just sat there, staring at the spot where the woman had vanished into the night. I kept telling myself it wasn't a big deal. People do strange things all the time. But something about her question wouldn't leave me alone. Why would she care if our campers were safe? And why show up in the middle of the night to ask? Lisa must have been thinking the same thing because, after a long silence, she said, "That was weird, right?" I nodded, trying to brush it off. "Yeah, but probably nothing." We decided to do a quick check on the kids, just to ease our nerves. Everything was normal. Every cabin was quiet, the kids fast asleep. Still, neither of us felt ready to go to bed. A couple of hours passed, and I was finally starting to feel like we might have overreacted. Then one of the counselors from the next site over, Tom, came sprinting out of the woods toward our campfire. He was out of breath, his face pale in the flickering light. "Did you see her?" he gasped. My stomach turned. "The woman in the kayak?" Lisa asked, already sounding panicked. Tom shook his head, glancing back toward the trail he'd come from. "She's not in a kayak anymore. She's just standing there, at the edge of our campsite." His voice cracked as he added, "She's got her arms out, like she's waiting for something." Lisa and I didn't even hesitate. We grabbed our flashlights and followed Tom back toward his campsite. I don't know what we were expecting to find, but I couldn't shake the dread pooling in my stomach. The woods felt different, too quiet, like even the crickets and frogs had gone silent. When we reached Tom's campsite, the rest of his group was huddled near the fire, whispering nervously. "She's over there," one of them said, pointing toward the trees. And sure enough, there she was. The same woman, now standing in the shadows just beyond the firelight. Her arms outstretched like she was waiting for someone to come to her. We all stood frozen, none of us daring to move closer. I shone my flashlight on her, and for a moment, I thought she might walk away like she did before. But she didn't. She just stood there, completely still, her face half hidden by the hood of her sweatshirt. Then, out of nowhere, she started to smile. It wasn't a friendly smile, it was cold, almost like she was enjoying our fear. "What do you want?" Lisa shouted, her voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. She just lowered her arms, turned slowly, and walked back into the woods, vanishing into the darkness like she'd never been there. Nobody slept that night. Tom's group decided to stick around at our campsite, figuring it was safer if we all stayed together. We kept the fire going, the light making the shadows dance around us in ways that only made us more paranoid. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, felt like a warning. Lisa and I tried to stay calm for the sake of the others, but I couldn't stop replaying the image of that woman in my head. Why was she here? What did she want? And the smile. God, that smile. It felt burned into my brain. At some point in the early hours of the morning, just before dawn, we heard it. A splash, faint but unmistakable, coming from the lake. Everyone froze, our ears straining to hear more. Then came the paddling, slow, deliberate strokes cutting through the still water. We grabbed our flashlights and ran to the shore, our beams slicing through the darkness. At first, we saw nothing, just the endless expanse of black water. But then, there she was, back in the kayak, her hood pulled up, her face turned toward us. She didn't say anything this time. She just sat there, watching us. And then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she started paddling away again, disappearing into the mist rising off the lake. When the sun finally came up, the whole night felt surreal, like some kind of shared nightmare. But the tracks near the lake, the unmistakable drag marks of a kayak being pulled onto shore, were proof that it had been real. Lisa and I tried to convince the kids and the other counselors that everything was fine, that it was just some local messing with us. But the truth was, none of us believed that. The woman didn't feel like a prank. There was something about her presence, how unnatural it was, how she seemed to move and disappear without a trace, that kept gnawing at me. By mid-morning, I decided to check in with the main camp office to report what happened. On the way there, I passed another group of counselors from a site farther down the lake. When I casually mentioned the woman in the kayak, one of them went pale. "Wait," she said, lowering her voice. "You saw her too?" My chest tightened as she described seeing a hooded woman a few nights earlier, drifting silently in a kayak, staring at their group from the water. They'd assumed it was just someone passing by, but the way the counselor spoke made it clear she was still shaken. "We didn't see her again after that," she added, almost like she was trying to reassure herself. The rest of the day dragged on, but the unease never left. Every time I looked at the lake, I half expected to see the woman sitting there, watching us from a distance. Lisa and I decided to keep a closer eye on the kids that night, taking turns walking the perimeter of the campsite while the others stayed by the fire. I don't know what I thought I'd accomplish. If she showed up again, what could I possibly do? But I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't done with us. Around midnight, as I was making my rounds, I noticed something odd. The canoe we'd left tied up at the dock earlier was now floating a few feet out, the rope trailing loosely in the water. My heart started pounding as I scanned the shoreline with my flashlight. That's when I saw it. Bare, wet footprints leading from the water to the middle of our campsite. They stopped abruptly, right in front of the fire pit, as if whoever left them had vanished into thin air. I called out for Lisa, and when she came running, her face turned as pale as mine when I pointed out the prints. We quickly checked all the cabins, but the kids were still asleep, completely unaware of what was happening. "It's her," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. "She's been here." We stayed up the rest of the night, jumpy and exhausted, but nothing else happened. By the time dawn broke, the footprints had dried, leaving no trace of what we'd seen. Lisa and I agreed not to say anything to the kids. We didn't want to scare them. But we couldn't stop looking over our shoulders, expecting her to reappear at any moment. It wasn't until the next afternoon that we heard from Tom's group again. They had packed up early and decided to leave the camp altogether. Tom pulled me aside before they left, his expression grim. "You should do the same," he said. "It's not just her. Last night, we saw something else. Something in the woods." He wouldn't elaborate, but the fear in his voice was enough to send chills down my spine. By the time our session ended a few days later, nothing else had happened, and we managed to get everyone back home safely. But even now, months later, I can't stop thinking about her. The woman in the kayak, her eerie smile, the wet footprints leading nowhere. I don't know who she was or what she wanted, and maybe I never will. But the part that haunts me the most is the way she just disappeared, like she was never really there at all. I've read a few similar stories online, people claiming to see strange figures near the water in this area. It makes me wonder if she's still out there, drifting silently across the lake, waiting for her next group of campers to find. The late-night boating incident, Tamagami region, Canada. I can't believe I'm even writing this because it still feels like a bad dream. This happened 2 summers ago when my friends and I went camping near the Tamagami region in Canada. It was supposed to be one of those carefree trips before we all went off to college. A weekend to laugh, make esmores, and just forget about everything. We set up our tents near this huge, still lake surrounded by dense woods. It was perfect, almost too perfect. The first night was uneventful, just us sitting by the fire, telling dumb ghost stories, and falling asleep to the sound of crickets and the occasional owl. But the second night, that's when everything went to hell. It was around 1 a.m. when I woke up. At first, I thought it was just the sound of water lapping against the shore, but then I realized I was hearing voices, angry voices. It sounded like an argument coming from a boat out on the lake. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but one voice was deep and furious, and the other was higher pitched, maybe a woman. I nudged Maddie, who was sleeping next to me, and she groggily listened too. By the time the other girls woke up, the argument had escalated into full-blown shouting. Then there was this awful blood-curdling scream, so loud it echoed off the trees, and just like that, silence. No voices, no splashing, nothing. For a few seconds, none of us said a word. I think we were all trying to process what we had just heard. Maddie whispered, "Did someone just fall in?" But I could tell she didn't believe it. The scream wasn't the kind of thing you'd hear from someone slipping into cold water. It was pure terror, like something horrible had happened. We debated whether we should do something, like yell out or try to find a way to help, but honestly, we were too scared to even unzip the tent. The lake was pitch black, and we couldn't see any sign of the boat or its passengers. It was like they had disappeared into the void. Then, just as I started to think we might have imagined the whole thing, we saw it, a beam of light cutting through the trees. It wasn't a flashlight, though. It was a harsh, sweeping spotlight, like the kind you'd see on a patrol boat. It moved methodically across the shoreline, scanning back and forth as if it were searching for something, or someone. When the beam hit our tents, the fabric lit up so brightly that I could see the silhouettes of everyone inside. None of us dared to move. We just sat there, frozen, as the light lingered for what felt like forever before finally moving on. We thought that was the end of it, but the light didn't go far. It moved down the shoreline, then swung back toward us. This time, it stopped directly on our tent. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. Maddie clutched my arm so tightly it hurt, but I didn't dare pull away. The beam stayed fixed on us, unmoving, like someone, or something, was staring straight at us. Then we heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the edge of the water. Crunch, 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 the sound of boots on gravel. None of us could see who, or what, was out there. The spotlight was so bright it washed everything else out, leaving the woods behind it in complete darkness. The footsteps got closer and closer until they stopped just outside the tent. For a moment, there was nothing but silence again. Then, without warning, a hand, or something, brushed against the tent wall. It was slow, almost curious, like it was feeling for something. Maddie let out this tiny, involuntary gasp, and that's when we heard a man's voice whisper, "I know you're in there." I swear my blood turned to ice. It wasn't just the words, it was how he said it, calm, almost amused, like he was enjoying the fear he knew we were feeling. None of us moved, not even to breathe. The only sound was the rustling of the tent fabric as his hand dragged slowly across it. Then the footsteps started again, circling us. The spotlight outside didn't budge, keeping us lit up like we were on some kind of stage. At one point, the shadow of his boots appeared at the base of the tent, and I almost screamed, but Maddie clamped her hand over my mouth just in time. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The footsteps, the whispering, the hand on the tent, it all just vanished. The spotlight clicked off, plunging us into complete darkness. We sat there in silence, straining to hear anything, but all we could make out was the sound of the lake lapping against the shore again. No footsteps retreating, no engine starting. Nothing to suggest whoever or whatever was out there had left. We didn't dare move for what felt like hours, just sitting there in the suffocating quiet, too afraid to even whisper. Eventually, the tension got unbearable. Maddie whispered, "We need to see if they're gone." None of us wanted to, but we also couldn't just sit there all night waiting for whatever that was to come back. We agreed to unzip the tent just a little, enough to peek outside. I volunteered, mostly because I was closest to the zipper, but my hands were shaking so bad it took me a couple of tries to get it open. When I finally did, all I could see was the faint outline of the trees against the moonlit sky. The boat was gone, and the lake was eerily still, like it had been untouched for hours. Feeling a tiny bit braver, we crawled out of the tent one by one. The air was cold, and everything was so quiet that every step we took felt deafening. We walked down to the shoreline, scanning the water for any sign of the boat or the spotlight, but there was nothing. No boat. No footprints in the gravel. It was like whoever had been out there had evaporated into thin air. Just as we were about to head back to the tent, Maddie grabbed my arm and pointed at something floating near the shore. It was a piece of fabric, dark and soaked through, just bobbing there in the water. None of us wanted to touch it, but it didn't feel right to leave it either. Maddie finally used a stick to fish it out, and when she lifted it, we realized it wasn't just fabric. It was a torn piece of a life jacket. Seeing that life jacket changed everything. Up until then, we could convince ourselves it was some creepy prank or a misunderstanding. But this was proof that something bad had happened. It had a jagged tear down the side, like it had been caught on something sharp, and there were faint stains on it that looked like blood. We dropped it immediately, backing away like it might come alive. None of us said it out loud, but I think we all had the same thought. Someone was out there, and they weren't okay, or worse, they weren't alive. We didn't want to stick around to find out. Back at the tent, we grabbed whatever we could in one trip: flashlights, phones, car keys, and bolted for the trail leading to the parking lot. The woods felt different now, like they were watching us. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves sent us into a panic, and we kept looking over our shoulders, expecting that spotlight to come back or those footsteps to start up again. The worst part was how long the trail felt, like it was stretching out on purpose to keep us there. By the time we made it to the car, we were out of breath and too scared to even look back. We piled into the car, and Maddie jammed the keys into the ignition with shaking hands. The headlights cut through the darkness, and for a split second, I thought I saw something. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the beam. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I was too scared to even check if anyone else saw it. Maddie floored it, and we tore out of there, gravel spraying behind us. The entire drive back to the nearest town was silent except for the occasional sniffle from one of the girls. None of us knew what to say, and honestly, I think we were too afraid to talk about it. When we finally reached a gas station, we stumbled inside, looking like we'd just seen a ghost. The clerk asked if we were okay, and Maddie tried to explain about the boat, the scream, and the life jacket, but she was barely coherent. The guy gave us a weird look and said we should call the police. So we did. They took our statement and said they'd send someone out to check the lake, but they didn't seem too concerned. One officer even suggested it was just a couple of fishermen messing around. But the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe that either. We never found out if they discovered anything, or if they even bothered to look. We tried to move on, but that night stuck with us. For weeks, I kept checking the news, expecting to see something about a body being found in the lake or a missing persons report, but there was nothing. It was like the whole thing had been erased. Maddie swore she would never go camping again, and honestly, I don't blame her. Even now, I can't hear the sound of water lapping against the shore without feeling a pit in my stomach. The weirdest part? A month after it happened, I looked up the Tamagami region out of curiosity and found a string of local rumors. Stories about strange lights on the lake and boats vanishing without a trace. Some even claimed the lake was cursed. To this day, I have no idea what we saw or what really happened out there. The life jacket, the spotlight, the footsteps, none of it makes sense. Sometimes I think maybe it's better that way. Whatever it was, it didn't follow us, and that's all I can really be thankful for. But every once in a while, late at night, I catch myself replaying that scream in my head, wondering who, or what, was out there on the water. And when I do, I can't help but feel like they're still out there, waiting for someone else to find them. The Appalachian Stalker, Georgia, USA. I didn't think much about it when Jake suggested we camp in the middle of nowhere. He's the kind of guy who thrives on that off-the-grid vibe, and honestly, I was craving a break from everything. So, we packed our gear and drove out to this remote spot in the Appalachian foothills. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing Jake swore he'd been to before. No signal, no other campers, just us three, me, Jake, and Sarah. At first, it was perfect. We set up the tent, built a fire, and spent hours swapping stories, laughing louder than we probably should have. The forest around us felt alive, but not in a creepy way. Just the rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the wind in the trees. That changed around midnight when Jake pointed out a light up on the ridge. It wasn't a campfire, that's for sure. It was this steady, bluish-white glow that moved like someone was walking with a flashlight. At first, I figured it was another camper, but the longer we watched, the weirder it seemed. The light didn't move naturally. It zigzagged, paused, then sped up. Jake said he didn't think anyone else was supposed to be out here, and that's when Sarah joked that we were being watched. We laughed it off, but I swear I felt something shift in the air, like the forest had gone too quiet. No wind, no crickets, nothing. Just that eerie light, weaving its way down the hill, getting closer with each pause. We tried to ignore the light, convincing ourselves it was probably a hunter or someone hiking late. Jake even joked about how embarrassing it'd be if we freaked out over nothing. But as the minutes passed, it became impossible to brush off. The light was getting closer, now maybe only a couple hundred yards from our campsite. And the way it moved, it didn't feel random anymore. It was deliberate, almost like it was scanning the area. Sarah whispered that we should put out the fire, and for once, Jake didn't argue. We doused it quickly, plunging ourselves into near darkness. That's when we heard the snapping of branches. It wasn't loud, but it was close, like someone trying to be quiet but not quite pulling it off. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, and Jake muttered under his breath, "Stay here." He grabbed his flashlight and stepped toward the edge of the clearing. I wanted to tell him not to go, but my throat felt tight. He shined the light into the trees, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, just as he lowered the beam, something moved. It was quick, darting behind a tree, but I swear it looked human. Jake cursed under his breath and backed up fast, saying, "We're leaving now." We scrambled to pack up, tossing things haphazardly into our bags. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped my flashlight twice, and Sarah kept asking Jake what he saw, but he wouldn't answer. "Just hurry," was all he said. The light on the ridge was gone now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever, or whatever it was, hadn't left. Then, as we were stuffing the last of our things into the car, I froze. Across the clearing, standing just at the edge of the tree line, was Jake. At least, it looked like Jake. Same height, same build, same hoodie, but he wasn't moving. He just stood there, staring at us. I turned to Jake, who was right next to me, and whispered, "Do you see that?" He looked up, and his face went pale. "Get in the car," he said, his voice barely audible. Sarah didn't even ask questions. She dove into the back seat while I climbed into the passenger side. Jake jumped into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys as I kept glancing out the window. The figure hadn't moved, but I swear I could feel its eyes on us. Finally, the engine roared to life, and Jake floored it, kicking up dirt as we sped down the narrow trail. But the further we drove, the worse the feeling got, like we weren't alone anymore. The dirt road seemed endless, twisting and turning through the dark forest, and Jake was driving like a madman. I kept glancing out the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, chasing us. For a while, there was nothing but the dust cloud behind us. Then Sarah, who'd been silent since we left, suddenly screamed, "There's someone back there." I whipped around, and sure enough, through the haze, headlights appeared. They came out of nowhere, and they were gaining on us fast. The car didn't look like anything official, just an old truck with its brights on, so intense they nearly blinded me. Jake cursed under his breath and pressed harder on the gas, but the truck kept closing the gap. "Who the hell is that?" Sarah shouted, her voice cracking. None of us had an answer. The truck started swerving, its lights swinging wildly like the driver was either drunk or trying to mess with us. And then it got worse. As it closed the distance, I swear I could make out someone in the driver's seat, but not clearly. Their face looked wrong, like it was stretched somehow. I tried to convince myself it was just the glare, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Jake was panicking now, and so were we. The road was too narrow to go any faster without risking a crash, but the truck didn't seem to care. It kept barreling toward us, closing the gap until it was practically on our bumper. Sarah was crying at this point, begging Jake to do something, but there was nothing to do except keep driving. Then, out of nowhere, the truck swerved sharply to the left, vanishing into the trees. It didn't stop, it just plowed straight into the woods like the driver didn't care about hitting anything. For a second, we all just sat there in stunned silence, the only sound the engine and my heart pounding in my ears. Jake slowed down a little, probably to catch his breath, but I told him to keep going. Something about the way that truck disappeared didn't sit right with me. And I was right to feel that way because, just a minute later, the headlights reappeared, this time, directly in front of us. Somehow, it had gotten ahead. How is that possible? Jake muttered, but no one answered. The truck wasn't moving now. It just sat there, blocking the road, its lights cutting through the darkness. Jake slammed the brakes, and for a moment, we just stared at it. Then the driver's door opened. The door creaked open slowly, and a figure stepped out, illuminated by the truck's blinding headlights. At first, it was hard to make out any details, but as they moved closer, I realized something was off. The way they walked, it was jerky, almost unnatural, like their joints weren't working properly. Sarah whimpered, "What is that?" but I couldn't answer. The figure stopped just a few feet from the front of our car, standing perfectly still. Then, without warning, they tilted their head, as if they were studying us. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. They were wearing the same hoodie Jake had on. Jake didn't wait to see more. He threw the car into reverse, and we sped backward down the trail, the tires skidding on loose gravel. The figure didn't move, just stood there watching us. But as we reversed, the truck's headlights cut off, plunging the forest into darkness again. We kept going, too scared to stop. After what felt like forever, Jake found a spot wide enough to turn the car around. We didn't say a word as he whipped the car around and sped back toward the highway, but the whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. We didn't stop driving until we hit the main road. None of us spoke, not even Sarah, who had been crying the entire time. It felt like if we said anything, we'd somehow invite whatever had happened to follow us home. Jake kept checking the rearview mirror, and I found myself doing the same, expecting to see those headlights pop up behind us again. But the road stayed empty, pitch black except for our own headlights cutting through the night. When we finally reached a gas station, we pulled in and sat there for a moment, trying to process what just happened. The silence was suffocating. Jake finally broke it, his voice shaky. "What the hell was that? That thing? It was wearing my hoodie." Sarah didn't respond. She just stared out the window, her hands trembling. I wanted to say something to make sense of it, but I couldn't. I kept replaying the way that figure moved, the way it just stood there in the middle of the road like it was waiting for us. We didn't bother trying to report it. What could we even say? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure. Even now, I still don't go camping. And every once in a while, when I'm driving alone at night, I catch myself checking the rearview mirror, waiting for those headlights to reappear.